I'm so interested, maybe perhaps dilettantishly, in physics. It feels that. I mean, the threshold for clearance in terms of the mathematics is just beyond me. However, the intuitions I find extremely compelling, and I've been reading a variety of different, as much as I can get my hands on in terms of quantum field theory in particular. So I've been reading Maudlin, Bohr, Heisenberg, Schrodinger, Al-Khalili, a bunch of different, perspectives, and getting as many ideas concerning what quantum theory and quantum thinking could potentially give me as a way of thinking about intensity. Hence,
it sounds like a really cool project.
Yeah. I mean, the speculative quantum poetics aspect of it is a little bit sketchier, but this idea of just trying to find, I guess, resonances in language vocabulary that'd be really helpful in terms of theorizing intensity. And so, I figured I'll just really pick your brain and see what you might have to, specifically from the vantage of somebody who's got a foot on water and a foot on land, so to speak, has philosophical framings for certain ideas, or even, I guess, means through which to sort of represent some more of the abstract aspects of the mathematics. So it'd be great to get your opinion. I can run through the spiel that I began my conversation with Jacob with, just as a way perhaps of grounding where we go. So the idea is to sort of develop a kind of intensity intuition. So to posit, I'm just reading from my notes so I get it right. To posit a rigorous, intuitive assemblage of ways of thinking about intensity and de-intensification. So the idea to sort of keep things on track would be to follow more or less 3 axioms or rules. So the first is that the candidates for a formalization of any aspect of thinking about speculative quantum poetics and so on has to sort of really deal or present the intuition in its simplest form. So it must be able to be expressed in language as best as possible, making it somewhat intuitively explainable. And the second axiom is that it must not rely on what Jacob called speculative metaphysical hypotheses. Which is a little bit more difficult because so much of the continental theory that influenced the later parts of this project are so steeped in what people could argue are speculative metaphysical hypotheses. But nonetheless, from specifically the vantage of a physicist, would have that constraint. And the third and final would be, it must correspond to something that is phenomenologically or maybe onto existentially observable, and the burden is on me to explain what I mean by those terms, but just for the sake of general discourse. So even in principle, it must in some way adhere to our current and past means of observation, or to quote Heisenberg, be available to our techniques and apparatuses of inquiry. So that's kind of the Grundrisse, the groundwork of trying to approach, gather as many sort of lines of flight and lodestars to follow concerning intensity. So maybe I'll just hand it over to you. What are your thoughts?
I very much like the sort of axiomatic approach that you're taking. It seems very methodical. I guess I don't think the word intensity, I have a lot. It seems to mean a lot of different things at once, and I can sort of disambiguate in lots of different contexts in which one might use the word intensity, and you would be meaning something different in all those contexts. So I wonder if there's some specific type of context that you're particularly interested in, or all of them, or
kind of as many as I could put in a productive frisson with one another. Perhaps I can't do them all. I mean, for example, Jacob was talking about Lagrangians and Hamiltonians, and this idea of intensity being a sort of numerical assignation of some kind of excitation that maybe passing a certain threshold of 5 sigma, what have you, sort of is intense enough to be, or intense enough to appear, to be an observable in sort of Bell's language. He also mentioned something a little weirder, monopoles, which I'd never heard of before. Thinking about getting down to something resembling something pre-Socratic, a kind of aperon, a kind of arche, a first principle, sort of something that you see string theory gesturing towards, sort of like the ground floor. But I think there's just so many other ways in which things like fluctuations or probability or collapse, for example, or branching, etc. They seem to me implicitly concerned with intensities in some way. Containments and burstings out of those particular containments. So all of it, basically, as much as I can get my hands on.
I mean, so you're specific. I mean, so I think of the word intensity as used in physics. Means something that is related, but in some ways quite different from what it might mean to describe like an emotion as intense, for example.
Absolutely.
Mm.
Yeah.
So you're interested more in the physics applications, or like the connections between different applications, or?
So I think like the I guess just the sort of conceptual ways of thinking about, yeah, I guess at some fundamental level, some kind of energetics, really,
Right.
and the way in which those which those sort of even words like interaction, et cetera, and so forth, they seem to me, at least anyway, naively to suggest some kind of not even impact in the sort of like particle atomic model, which I think is a picture that a lot of people have in their minds when they think of energy, even from a lay perspective, thinking of something like a photon or electron. I think in their mind they think of like a snooker table, billiard balls, just kind of colliding. But thinking of something, thinking of a field, for example, as this universally spread out intensity that's kind of like a skin of a drum, which kind of just has these ruptures and burstings of things that become available to be observed with our limited sense apparatuses and the tools that we bring to bear to extend them. So I'm just really curious to sort of like how many different, or if there, maybe I could make it more precise and put a sharper point on it. When you think of intensity as a physicist, what things come to mind? Just immediately.
Yes. Well, I mean, probably the most immediate thing would be, as you say, to do with fields. I think something that's interesting is that if you sort of look at classical or physics or non-relativistic quantum physics, there's a sense in which like energy or intensity is a property that is carried by entities, and so it's sort of a separate thing. It's not the thing itself. I think as you move further into QFT, what you see is that in some sense everything is the intensity. There's nothing else. There's no carrier of the intensity. That just is reality. So there's a sense in which that concept, I guess, becomes much more and more important as you move away from classical physics.
Right. And so, which is interesting insofar as looking at the standard models that sort of like map of intensity, or some kind of almost like a sensor plate that's just sensitive to all the ways in which these sort of intensities burst through some kind of field of observation. But there's obvious gaps and problems even in the sort of underlying methodology. Questions like what is an observation or a measurement, which are fascinating to me. As a theoretician and as a somewhat philosopher. But there's gravity is the most conspicuous, I guess, omission or sort of problem that almost resists reconciliation. I mean, would you think of gravity as an intensity? And if so, what makes it unique as an intensity compared to others, like the photoelectric effect or something like that?
Yes, I mean, I think there's two different theoretical models in which we have to think about gravity, because certainly in some contexts it's very helpful to think of gravity as just a field like any other field, and you have some kind of flat space-time and then you have a gravitational field defined on it, particularly in low energies. That works very well, and that is how we think about it. But we know that that's not the whole story, because from relativity, we know that the connection between gravity and space-time is, of course, tighter than it is for other types of fields. So I guess there's a sense in which, as you go deeper into quantum gravity, I mean, we don't have the full story yet, but it looks as though certainly gravity is not going to be the same kind of intensity as other types of fields, because it's not going to be sort of defined on a preset background. Maybe there's a sense in which it is still an intensity, but now the intensity, it's sort of perhaps a more extreme version of what we've already seen in QFT, but now we lose even the background. There's not a background that carries the intensity. The intensity is the background as well.
Amazing. To me, that's a very poetic formulation. And there's sort of interesting reversals, and the kind of polysemy or sort of the metalepsis of the idea that it's kind of its own shadow. And Nietzsche talks about this. I think it's in the Gay Science, where he talks about the shorter shadow, an object being dressed in itself as a sort of like base, where it doesn't cast a shadow, so to speak. It's very fascinating. And well, I guess which leads to other types of intensities that people might experience, I think, in their day-to-day lives as intense in some way, but don't really think of it as some kind of like intensity in the same way that they would think about gravity, for example. But they have similar effects. I'm, of course, talking about time. And I know that you've worked with Carlo Rovelli. I have one of his Folio Society copies of his philosophy of time. It's a
Oh,
beautiful
lovely.
volume.
Yeah.
It's
He's a
gorgeous.
beautiful writer. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think I remember you talking about the Sudoku universe model.
Yeah.
And thinking of time in some ways distributed. Is that fair to say, or is that an erroneous picture to develop, this idea that time might have a field-like property, or you could imagine it in that way, with different points on this particular field being assigned a value, or probability for something appearing there to be measured?
Yes. I mean, I think we're still there's still a lot we don't understand about time. But perhaps looking at the sort of most recent stuff in quantum gravity, I'm tempted to think of time as being a sort of perspectival thing that, relative to my perspective on the universe, I can sort of define a timeline and a space-time around me, but that in some sense exists only within this specific perspective. And you can sort of stitch these perspectives together in some ways, but the result is not going to have time in the sort of conventional sense, because that is so built into our type of perspective that we have.
Well, yeah, I'd agree with that. Yes, I mean, I have a second single authored monograph coming up this year with Bloomsbury, which is about 20th and 21st century time travel cinema. So I've been thinking a lot about time, and a lot about time, philosophies of time and time travel, and this kind of fundamental problem that seems to sort of take on a variety of different iterations going forward in time or in history. This kind of Heraclitus versus Parmenides, flow or not flow, strife, and the sort of language that he brings to bear even to describe sort of the experience of time. He refers to the strife and warfare and outbreaks of fire, like as if time is some kind of computer. And then seeing something like Stephen Wolfram's Rouliad model, where it has this kind of, it looks arborescent on the one hand, it looks like a tree, but at the same time, it kind of looks like a flame. But I'm very interested in time as an intensity, or as a force of de-intensification, as much as it is a force of intensification of experience, of the potential emergence of complexity. Entropy is another maybe naive candidate for intensity. That's great. That's a lot to go on. But I mean, insofar as poetry or the elision perhaps of physics, and not just other types of theory, but other types of artistic praxis, I mean, do you often find that you have the opportunity to find those two things commingled in your career, or is it something they have to put together yourself, so to speak?
I mean, certainly I think there's an extent to which particularly philosophical writing about physics involves some of the same kinds of creativity that might be involved in poetry or creative writing of various kinds. I separately, I do write creative stuff which is informed, I guess, by my work, but that's not so much what I do for my career. But I do think particularly when one is thinking about sort of really fundamental physics that is sort of far from the regimes that we can experience, there's a sort of push and pull here where on the one hand, there's nothing that we can really visualize very straightforwardly. So it becomes in some ways more important to call on sort of various kinds of metaphors and to give us something to conceptualize. But on the other hand, sometimes the metaphors are a bit dangerous because they kind of give us a false idea of the thing that we're talking about. So I think there's this kind of push and pull where you do have to use metaphor. You do need this kind of figurative thinking, but you also want to be really careful that you're not being misled by your own metaphors.
That's sound counsel, and reminds me of an idea called the procession of simulacra by a guy called Jean Baudrillard. This idea that people get ensconced with a sense of sufficiency provided by a map as opposed to the territory that it supposedly represents, and you just kind of get a reality mediated by pictures as opposed to sort of attempting to give credence or veracity or test those images. And I guess, I mean, when you're doing, as you say, foundational physics or engaging with some kind of high level mathematics, do you have a kind of synesthetic response to these figurations and these kind of formulations, in the sense that you kind of see them in some sense, or do they remain at or contained at the level of kind of that notation?
I personally don't. I think some people do have quite visual responses to these things and do sort of think about math in quite visual terms. I'm more of a wordy person, so I tend to explain
Sure,
it to myself in words in my head.
sure.
So I appeal to metaphors, but metaphors, I guess, expressed in words rather than in pictures so much. I do think that everybody, in some sense, is working with some kind of, you know, either literal picture or word picture to try to gain some sort of intuition for these things, and the pictures are
Sure.
very helpful to a certain extent, but yeah, can only be taken so far.
Yeah, I can imagine that, absolutely. And also the necessity to sort of convey those intuitions across disciplinary lines, for example, where in which, for example, if you laid out a formula for me, even something that you consider to be quite rudimentary, I'd be sweating, you know. So I appreciate it when science communicators or people who engage in the sort of public facing discourse are careful
Yeah,
about the images that they present, but are also not averse to appealing to verse in order to kind of give shape to those particular
yes.
intuitions. And I mean, speaking of just, you know, poetry in particular, do you have favorite poets or poets that you found that you constantly think about even in your sort of scientific engagements, or maybe even just more broadly if you have a favorite poet or poets?
I'm very fond of Janet Frame. um who else? I enjoy some Ashbery.
Okay.
Anne Michaels. Oh, Margaret Atwood. Yeah, so a variety of people.
Right. Yeah. That's such an interesting assemblage. Yeah, I
Yeah.
think it's such an interesting. So I started numinously thinking about when I looked at sort of my doctoral work and my postdoctoral work and thinking about what it is that I've been really thinking about.
Yeah.
Um, I think I winnowed things down to sort of intensity, and I was like, right, okay. So going forward, I'm going to pursue that, and I felt as if the first intensity that I had to try and deal with in some sense was time, because I
Yeah.
was watching a lot of 20th, specifically 21st century science fiction, time travel cinema, and time travelers always die. There's always this real sense of enclosure and entrapment,
Yeah.
even if you know retrocausality and so on are allowed to play in your particular narrative and so on, that there's this sense of a kind of numinous monster stalking everybody that was unslakable.
Yeah.
But at the same time, you do get sort of insertions of this kind of joie de vivre, or kind of gamified response to that kind of temporal absurdity, you know, Bill and Ted and things like
Yeah.
that. But there's always, I was just surprised at how many time travelers found themselves dead as a
Yes.
sort of necessity. So I thought, okay, let me approach that. But then when I started thinking about, well, you know, thinking about things like entropy and information and observation, I was like, there might be a way of thinking a little bit broader in terms of some kind of speculative quantum poetics, speculative in the sense that it would have no sort of experimental basis, save
Right.
a reading. And then I started looking up, you know, quantum fiction and quantum poetry. And there's a contemporary poet by the name of Amy Catanzaro, beg your pardon. She's released a lot of material, poetic and essayistic, that kind of thinks about the various ideas of quantum mechanics as a potential form of poetry that you can sort of plug in, I guess, different metrics, sort of meter and image and so on and so forth, as
Oh,
opposed to
nice.
sort of figures, and see what emerges, which is really interesting.
Oh, cool.
There's three texts: the imaginary present, poetry and superposition, and the positron passport. Are really, really, really lovely. And I don't mean this as a sort of a critique. When I did engage with some of the work, I did find that formally, it still really looked like a poem. You know,
Yeah.
it still really resembled, you know, stanzas, and it's, you know, even sort of certain metrics and meter. And I was like, okay, so if we're thinking of things like superpositions or a poetic form that could be like a superposition, I think of even older things that were in some sense more satisfactory or more quantum, like a palimpsest, you know, just layers upon layers. That seems to be more superpositional, quite literally.
Yeah.
That's a beautiful cat, by the way.
The cat is about to fall off. Come on, don't do that.
um, And I think a lot of her work is informed by this one essay by a guy called Charles Platt from April 1990, Quantum Fiction, a Blueprint for Avoiding Literary Obsolescence. And he's pulling from people like, well, looking at things like, cyber poetry and cyber text, hypertext, thinking about people like Joyce and Borges and Nabokov and choose your own adventure novels and the cut-up style of Burroughs, or even people like Ballard and so on. So I think that's more formally the sort of, I guess, the extremity of the poetic formulations in those particular styles of poetry seems to be more accurate in terms of trying to represent anything quantum in nature. Because to me, the quantum is quite extreme, despite being so small, or maybe as a result of being so small. But even poets like W.B. Yeats, I think he has this poem called He Wishes for the Clots of Heaven, which, if you're thinking about the clots as fields, feels like a pretty poetic representation of quantum theory. So, I guess I can recite that poem. I've remembered it. It's very short. It says, had I the heavens embroidered cloths enwrought with golden and silver light, the blue and the dim and the dark cloths of night and light and the half-light, I would spread the cloths under your feet, but I, being poor, have only my dreams, and I've spread my dreams under your feet. Tread softly, because you tread on my dreams. So, treading as a type of observation, or, the different types of fields cloths as interacting fields, maybe the paucity of observation and its limits being a sort of poor dream of the system that you're actually in. I accidentally, I was like, oh, that's a kind of neat way of maybe thinking about some of these ideas. And I guess that brings me to a question of, would you ever try, or have you tried, or even interested in trying, and sort of bringing those two, I guess, fields of endeavor together for yourself?
Yes, I have tried. Just personally, not in like any published work or anything. But I guess I think a lot about this stuff in my work, and so it's on my mind a lot when I'm doing creative writing as well. And so one tries to sort of have some sort of expression of the, and I think a lot of ideas in quantum mechanics are quite metaphorical or poetic in nature anyway, so they're quite easy to draw on it as sort of, we use metaphors to understand quantum mechanics, but then you can sort of reverse that, and quantum mechanics can become metaphors for features of human life and emotions and these kinds of things. It's a very nice sort of fit, I think.
Right. Yeah. I agree, and it's interesting to see where how that interfacing allows people, I think, to specifically, it's awesome for me to see physicists talk about how they feel about stuff, as opposed to just what they think about, which is, maybe an arbitrary distinction, but it seems to play, certainly, off screen. And I think there was a conversation that you're having with Jacob Brandes, I think was invigilated by Kurt Jaimungal, where, there was you're talking about quantum teleportation, and what if you had a double or a copy that had to be expired in order for another one of your copies to sort of persist. And you said that, I liked your response because it was unanxious. And you're like, yeah, well, if that were the case, if I did have this kind of angst about this particular circumstance, then I wouldn't go to sleep. This idea of a sort of a lower conscious ground state, and then a sort of excitation in consciousness, sleep, the deletion of a copy, not that different. So it got me thinking about, what do you think people most get wrong in terms of their pictures of certain ideas of quantum theory in particular? And do you find, as a follow-up, do you find that there's a lot of fear? Are people scared of quantum ideas in your experience?
Yes. Well, I think what most the main thing I see people getting wrong often is just a tendency to take the mathematics too literally. I think as a physicist, you work a lot with the math, and you sort of get very absorbed into the math, and it starts to feel very real and concrete. And so it's very, very tempting as a result of that to sort of read it all as being literal representations of what's happening in the world. But I think we have very good reasons to think it can't all be literal because of the measurement problem. Some part of it needs to be taken understood differently. So I think as a physicist, it's helpful to sort of take a step back sometimes and remember that the sort of concreteness of it that you feel when you're doing the calculations is in some ways an illusion, and that it doesn't all have to be totally literal.
Sure.
In terms of fear, I think, so, well, certainly among physicists, I think there are certain intuitive ideas about how the world works that people are quite unwilling to let go of, even if quantum mechanics seems to be suggesting that they're wrong. The two I encounter the most often are about locality and about time evolution. A lot of physicists have a strong intuition that things should be local, and have been very concerned to try to rewrite the theory in some way to make it be local. Even though the sort of the obvious reading of it is that it's not local. And similarly, I think there are really good reasons to think that quantum mechanics and relativity and quantum gravity altogether are showing us pretty clearly that we shouldn't think of things in terms of time evolution. But people have a really strong intuition about time evolution that I think is very hard to let go of, because it's so bound up with our ideas about ourselves as sort of beings persisting over time, and our lives as temporal beings. And I think letting go of that is very hard, and there is some kind of fear involved in that.
Sure. It seems to me kind of a thanatotic fear underneath it all, a fear of death ultimately.
Yes.
That continuity is far more appealing than discretion.
Yes.
And yeah, even the idea, I think it was Brian Greene. He might have been talking to Neil deGrasse Tyson, I'm not sure. And they're talking about, Neil deGrasse Tyson says to Brian Greene, I think it's on the Star Talk podcast, he says to Chuck, tell him about this idea that since you told me over lunch, I've not really been able to sort of like sleep. This idea that, particle-antiparticle pairs are kind of woven together. They're kind of these, I guess, quantum tunnels or whatever you wish to call them, that form this sort of space-time weave. And if you discretize them mathematically anyway, then the fabric just kind of disintegrates. It just turns to ash. And maybe I think some of that fear is kind of eschatonic, it's apocalyptic in the sense that these phenomena that ostensibly make themselves available to us mathematically and through observation as well are so fundamentally tied to being with a capital B that if they were slightly otherwise, or if they are made to be otherwise with high energies and so on, or long periods of time, then what being is relative to a human being is very fragile.
Yes.
Yeah, and I wonder maybe. Oh, sorry, please.
So I think that the expectation that you are going to have your future experiences is so central to we've got so much emotional investment in it. It's so central to our idea of who we are and how we live. That I think any version of physics which challenges that assumption or raises that into question is very frightening, because the thought that this moment is all you ever have and you're not really going to become your future self is, I think, very hard to sort of emotionally accept.
That's fascinating, because it would lead me to ask you whether or not, as you were studying, as you were going specifically in the burgeoning aspects of your career, where you came across ideas that completely just, seemed large enough to knock a giant lopsided. They were just so earth-shattering, and they just change your perspective, a sort of paradigm shift. I mean, it's a phrase that's bandied around quite lightly, but I mean it in its most severe form. Did you find those moments frightening in any way, or did you find them just purely as expansive? Because I have similar experiences in theory, encountering certain, and I mentioned this to Jacob, people like, Derrida or someone like this, and he's like, oh, now you're going into continental land. He made a joke. But it's you do receive some of that as if, there's nothing to be scared of because it's quite fictitious. But the intuitions, for example, that these particular lines of flight deduce seem to be quite accurate, that you can observe anyway. And the consequences and the extremity of their conclusions seems to be borne out in experience, which can stagger a lot of people, can make it quite a simultaneously a character building enterprise, but one that really shakes notions of self. And I wonder if you had experiences like that as you were learning your field.
Yes, I do think, well, particularly these types of issues around personal identity and persistence over time, I think those are the ones that are perhaps the most most threatening and emotionally challenging out of all the things I've done in philosophy. And at the same time, I mean, there's some fear involved, but I think in a way also thinking that way is sometimes, I think, helpfulness in the sense. I think it has helped me with thinking about regret and thinking about forgiving my past self for things that have gone wrong and mistakes, and being able to let go of that and say, that's not really the same person. I'm connected to this person, but I'm a different person now. And I think that sort of those philosophical ideas about what personal identity really is has sort of helped me to let go of the sort of being too closely tied to my past self, if you see what I mean.
I really do. I think that's beautifully put. And I think the most positive, I don't even want to say productive, that feels cheap, but I think the most positive way of responding to a kind of adamantine reality, continuity is in some sense an illusion and so on, including the illusion of self. But I mean, in those particular branchings and ruptures and probabilistic sort of outcomes, the stochasticity of your life, there's so much potential I like being surprised. Even if the surprise isn't that great, I forget, people often, because I often write about graphic novels and comic books, I can't tell you how many times I see the quote from Christopher Nolan's The Dark Knight where the Joker says, the thing about chaos is it's fair. And so to me, that idea is fundamentally interesting. And I have it might give me a bit of vertigo, but it doesn't make me feel sort of completely nihilistic, if I could put it that way.
Yeah, I think a lot of people are not very, a lot of physicists particularly are very keen on determinism and would like everything to be deterministic, partly because I guess that's more mathematically tractable. But yeah, I think there is something that's quite appealing in the idea of indeterminism, in the sense that, although I believe that in some sense all of time exists and is sort of fixed, I think that the existence of indeterminism from a sort of internal point of view does give you a sense in which the future is really genuinely open, and that, there's a part of the world yet to be discovered, and we genuinely can't know from our current point of view what it's going to be. I think that sort of does introduce a kind of novelty that is quite interesting and appealing.
Yeah, there's a sort of perdurantist poetry of it in some sense, which I find that very, very, very fascinating. Maybe as a concluding question that I might ask you, I mean, this has been so rich and so helpful, so thank you again.
This is very fun.
Yeah, I think maybe so on this notion of perhaps this, again, this the word that comes to mind is the sort of frisson between fear and excitement in sort of excitations or demands to sort of restructure a worldview, or in some way to paint over a picture or to tear the picture in half. It's like there's so much I see often in sort of, I guess, the science communicator sphere, a lot of, and it might be just clickbait, but a lot of presentations of this idea of crises, a variety of different crises in physics, as if there was some kind of latent fear of perhaps observational limits ultimately, and maybe the necessity of other disciplines to buttress those ostensible gaps, things like, for example, theoretical computer science and things of this ilk, something that you can simulate the type of high energy or low energy states or times that you can't otherwise physically observe in any other way. But I also imagine, and it might not necessarily be as widely gazetted, specifically within the disciplines, an excitement of things that kind of emerge that physicists turn their attention to and say, yeah, we should really, this sounds really promising. This sounds really interesting. We should really pay attention to this, not just fund it and staff it, but really just as a concept that has emerged to us now, we should really pursue. I mean, what type of ideas would fit that particular description from your perspective?
Yeah, great question. I think there's a sense in which we certainly hasn't been a lot of sort of new experimental progress in recent years, and in some sense there hasn't been any sort of very concrete theoretical progress in the sense of things that have been confirmed and known to be right. But there have been a bunch of really fascinating new ideas which people are still exploring, and all sorts of good things are coming out of them. And in some sense, maybe it doesn't even matter so much whether they turn out to be right or not. They've still been really interesting and have led to all sorts of cool insights. So holography, I guess, is one thing that really comes to mind. It hasn't really been used to sort of predict anything or make any new technology or anything like that yet, but it has led to some really, really cool, fascinating developments, which I think almost certainly will turn out to be applicable somewhere for something eventually. I think for me, a lot of the recent work on sort of perspectives and quantum reference frames, thinking about how you go from sort of a third person description to a first person perspective. Again, this is sort of theoretical and is still early in development, but I think it's raising a bunch of really interesting questions, both in physics and sort of philosophically, about how to think about perspectives in science and the relationships between them. So all of those ideas, I think, are leading to really fascinating discussions, and progress is definitely being made, even if it's not direct experimental progress.
That's brilliant. That's really exciting. I mean, holography is something that, and I every time that I read a description, I think, oh, cool, I got it this time. But then I always doubt myself. So I mean, maybe even taking just like a couple of minutes to just kind of lay out like maybe the most simplest intuition of how somebody could understand holography. But I remember reading Jana Levin's Black Hole Survival Guide, and she describes sort of quantum entanglement using like a painting metaphor, and it was the clearest that I ever got it. I was like, oh, interesting, that, this kind of intuitive poetic representation of the phenomena, whether or not it's mathematically rigorous. I think I got some of the most radical implications of that presentation of the idea.
Right.
Yeah, and I mean this I guess quantum perspectives must necessarily in some sense be an object of study because of the observer problem ultimately.
Yeah.
Thinking of perspectives.
There's a big research field on quantum perspectives. I think it has not yet been connected up enough to the measurement problem and the observer problem, because as you say, I think for sure it must be relevant, and I think we haven't quite figured out how to make the connections effectively yet, but for sure that there must be some connection here.
That's exciting. That's terribly exciting. Wow.
It's fascinating. Yeah, I think it's a really cool area.
I'm going to, when I listen to this back, I'm going to jot down some notes of things to pursue. I mean, maybe if you could, in sort of a whistle stop fashion, like maybe let's do it in reverse order. To from your experience, in communicating the idea, really note what it is that people constantly get wrong about holography. Like the sort of error of the understanding of the intuition, and then maybe your version of what it is.
Yes. Well, I think one thing people often get wrong about holography is it's often presented as though holography is something to do with string theory. And I think it was originally sort of conceived of and developed in the context of string theory, but it is a much more general idea, which does seem to apply pretty much to any theory of quantum gravity in some sense. So I think it's important to talk about it more generally than that, because string theory very likely won't turn out to be right, but I think the idea of holography is much more general. I mean, the idea of it is it's based on some sort of theoretical results suggesting that if you have like a region of space-time, you might expect naturally that the sort of information content of the region scales with the volume. But it transpires that, or there are good reasons to think that, in fact, it scales with the surface area instead. So in some sense, there's sort of like limits. So in some sense, surfaces are playing a more important role in physics than you might have previously understood. And in some sense, there's sort of less information present in regions than you would have expected. And so that leads to various proposals where you can sort of, certainly in special cases, you can write down a sort of gravity theory inside a region of space-time and then map it to a sort of field theory on the boundary, on the surface. And then, so if you can't calculate stuff using the gravity theory, that's okay. You could just calculate it on the surface using boundary theory instead and get your outcome. So mathematically, it's a super convenient way of doing certain kinds of calculations. Beyond that, it certainly feels as though this existence of this kind of mapping is telling us something important about space-time and like what it is and its nature. And I think we haven't quite figured out what it's telling us yet, but it seems to me very suggestive and interesting.
Fantastic. That's awesome. Wow, it's so rich. And I've got a lot to chew over and think about. And hopefully in the future, I mean, if you're open to sort of, continued lines of conversation, specifically the poetic aspects, kind of sharpen that a little bit more. I think I'm so deep in the physics right now, specifically the QFT, and I'm having a great time. So I'm really just trying to speak to as many physicists as I can who are open to having these kind of, I guess you could call them interdisciplinary discourses. I mean,
for sure.
that kind of polymathic approach is something that I think we've the academy's kind of ironed out of itself, what's kind of being beaten out
That's a
in
pity. Yeah, I
unfortunate
agree.
ways. So I really appreciate you taking the time.
Yeah, no, very happy to
And
keep in touch if you've got any other thoughts at some time.
for sure, I'll definitely take you up on that. I'm just waiting for the second monograph to come out. The galleys are coming back. I got to index it and so on.
Indexes are no fun. Yeah.
It's going to take a while. I really threw the kitchen sink at it. I thought, if this is the last book that I write, then I got to write one for me, and this is what I'm interested in. So
Yeah.
it's scary because there's nothing really to hide behind. I guess it's really what I think. So hopefully it turns out right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Cool. Well, thank you so much, Emily.
Thank you very much. It was really fun.
Cool. Have a good day.
Have a great day. Cheers.
Bye then.